Vampires exist. Ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren spoke publicly in regards to the existence of vampires.
I'd like to ask you about vampires just to start right off. Are there such a thing as vampires, and can you tell me an example of one?
Positively, vampires do exist.
This subject and topic is quite fitting considering spooky season is now in full effect, and I'm excited. I definitely want to take some midnight strolls through Salem at this point and see what I can discover. So, who else has this? Who else has these EVPs? The paranormal, the occult, the otherworldly, the unexplained. It is real life for me. This is real world, real life, every single day. This is my profession. This is what I do, but it's also my passion and what I was born into. So you can think of it like the real life Dean Winchester from the show Supernatural. And by the way, I've only seen up to season 2.5. So I'm almost to season 3. It's an interesting show. The supernatural is real. It's very real, and you would be, honestly, in my opinion, crazy if you didn't believe in the supernatural. And that's what I do. I bring proof to the table and evidence, and we unlock doors with it. Obsidian, my kitten, and I are here to tell you something interesting about vampires. So I've been in the paranormal for I'd say my whole life since I was born, and it goes back just hundreds and hundreds of years with my family. I never once thought that I would be saying what I'm about to say. Vampires exist. Now hear me out, I have a whole case on this.
2 years ago, my youngest daughter woke up with marks on her neck that looked like vampire bites. We didn't know exactly what to do, but she did experience some issues for about 2 weeks. She couldn't stand light, she slept all day, she had all the symptoms of typical vampire ways.
I never thought that I would say one day, there is a vampire walking amongst us witches in Salem, Massachusetts. I have to show you the evidence and what brought me to this finding and discovery. I loved vampires as a child, and I always wanted to be one when I was younger. I don't know anymore if I would want to take on an eternal life, because I definitely want to explore the afterlife one day. So one of my dear friends, who is a death doula and mental health professional, she brought a case to me that was a woman crying out. She had a plea for help. Her daughter is being bitten. It looks like fang marks on her neck, on her ankle, her son-in-law.
2 years ago, my youngest daughter woke up with marks on her neck that looked like vampire bites. We didn't know exactly what to do, but she did experience some issues for about 2 weeks. She couldn't stand light, she slept all day, she had all the symptoms of typical vampire ways, and we thought it was maybe her imagination. We couldn't quite figure it out. We tried everything. We called a doctor, we investigated. These marks just appeared on her neck out of nowhere. The bites lasted on her neck, like they slowly fade. They were a typical bite. They were like a bite that had healed, but it was there. Like one night it wasn't, the next morning it was, but it took about a month for the bites to fade. And we thought it was an isolated incident. We were checking everybody else's neck in the house. It was fine. About a month later, my daughter looked down at her ankle, same exact bite, and they were faded as if she was bitten the same time as my youngest daughter was bitten. We just didn't notice it. Same size, same dimension apart, same size, everything the same except a different part of her body. When this first started, we all lived in the same house. Me and my 4 children and my son-in-law. We all lived in the same house. And this happened over a span of 2 years. So the next year, by this time, my daughter and her fiance had moved out. So a few months later, my daughter called me. She said, "Mom, the bites are back. This time, they're on my arm." And she had a bite on her arm, same size bites, same dimension apart, everything the same, just now on her arm. But the bite was changing, and it was not going away, as if she was being bitten in the same spot multiple times. And even the bite started to even like I don't know, like spread as if she was being bitten over and over again in the same spot. Didn't know what to do. And she says, "Okay, I've been bitten, Tajay's been bitten, now Keenan's being bitten." And I'm like, what do you mean? So she sends me this video of the bites, on very obvious bites, same size, same dimension apart, on her fiance's neck. So now I'm confused. Okay, so I'm like, okay, so this is not just my children. Now I'm really like, I'm seeking out paranormal experts. I'm emailing people. I'm reaching out to, even famous paranormal, trying to figure out, hey, psychics, everybody. Hey, can somebody tell me something? Because this is getting ridiculous. And now the vampire, it was a vampire, started really biting Keenan. So at one point, Keenan had bites, just bites, all over his neck. And he wasn't trying to hide it. He was very obvious. My children and I, we experienced the paranormal. This is not the first time. So I'm trying to figure this out. I'm trying to understand. I'm trying, we're not freaking out. Everybody stay calm. So I reached out to one person, and they were like, "Oh, it's aliens. Aliens tracking your bloodline." So if you read your history, many believe that the human race was altered. We weren't created by aliens, but our bodies have been altered by aliens. Like the pyramids and all that stuff was supposedly built by humans, but we were so smart that they suppressed. There's a DNA strand in us that's blocked. And supposedly that's the strand that opens up the other parts of our brain. I don't know. Anyway, so they're saying, oh, when so-called the world's about to end, these aliens coming back for a select few. So maybe it's aliens tracking your bloodline. I'm like, okay. Then the last most sense I heard was a psychic. She's a well-known, she's psychic around the world. I got in touch with her on Facebook, and I sent her a bunch of messages. She responded, and she said, well, let me meditate and let me see if I can find out what this is. She got back to me and she told me it is a vampire. And I'm like, okay, why? And she said, well, he wants to turn your oldest daughter. He said he's come here and he ain't going nowhere. He wants your oldest daughter. So now I'm asking this woman, why is this vampire, if he wants my oldest daughter, why is he biting everybody? Except me. He doesn't bite me, but he bites all the adult children. He bites my adult son-in-law. He's careful not to bite my youngest son, which is the minor. And she said, because if he bit Alexis every time he came, he'd kill her. So that's when I got alarmed. I'm like, okay, this is too much.
So at the end of this film, I have a bonus clip, and in 2 of my books that I've written, New Orleans Chambers, Conjure Ghosts and Bones, and Discovery of Witches, there is a seductive vampirism section, and I'm going to read it to you because it's testimonies from when I lived and worked in New Orleans, Louisiana. And these testimonies were eyewitness accounts of vampires. So I am a paranormal professional, a demonologist, an esoteric symbology specialist, an EVP specialist, forensic audio analysis specialist. So I've seen a lot and I deal with a lot. And this particular case was interesting because it was based around aliens and vampires. The paranormal has been my entire life. I was literally born into it. And I've seen a lot. I have pictures of aliens, extraterrestrials, demons, angels, ghosts, levitating, floating, hovering entities. I have camera footage of entities walking across the camera. You know, I have the most incredible EVPs in the world, according to many folks and many viewers and people within the field. So I've seen a lot. But vampires? I mean, I've met actual vampire hunters before, and I've come across vampire stories because I've traveled the entire United States working my cases in the paranormal and the occult and all of that. But this is just incredible. You know, I've only come across a few accounts of vampires, and it was always kind of linked in with aliens, such as the cattle mutilations. And I used to own ranches and farms all across the South. So what's interesting about this particular case, so I saw the photos of the bite marks on her daughter and her son-in-law. And what's interesting is that I have seen the same marks on abductees who were abducted by extraterrestrials, aliens, all of that. And there were scientists who actually pulled out these living organisms from the abductees because they said they were cut into and that something was placed inside of them. And I remember seeing those marks. So they do look a lot like these vampire bite marks. You know, it's one thing to accept the existence of demons and ghosts and angels and our souls in the afterlife. And I've seen all those things. And, you know, but I don't think I've ever seen a vampire. So my dear friend, she sends me this case, and it's so interesting to me, and this woman's plea for help. So I'm bottle feeding Obsidian, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get out of bed, and I'm going straight to my office, which is where I'm sitting now, and I'm going to do a seance session. It is what I specialize in, divinatory ways. So I get out of my seance session, and I didn't think that they said that much. I could not believe it, though. Now, another psychic who worked on this case got the same thing from her spirits and guides as well, that it is, in fact, indeed, a vampire. I couldn't believe what I heard them say, though. They said, I was like, what I always do is I keep a pretty general question open, and I say, spirits, my spirits, all the 11 that I work with, what can you tell me about vampires? And they said there's a vampire amongst Salem. And I just could not believe that. Oh, I can't believe they said that.
What can you tell me about vampires?
So then I asked what they could tell me about Dracula. And they said, blood, something inaudible, ancient.
A long time ago, I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula?
So then I asked them specifically about vampires who drink blood, the creature, because I know that there's vampiric folks out there. And I wanted to be clear on the distinction. So then they said, his casket buried alive. So when I asked about, specific creatures of vampires that actually drink blood, they said they're around and they're hunted.
What can you tell me about vampires? A little while ago I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula?
And they said that about Dracula.
Protecting me. What can you tell me about vampires?
Thank you very much.
Does or do vampires that drink human blood exist? Dracula.
I don't know. I've always believed in vampires. I've always been I find them fascinating. Fascinating. Since I was a child. And I wrote about this in some of my books. But this is incredible. This is incredible. Seance is what I specialize in the most above all. It's very sacred to me. To be able to record the spirits that I work with, their voices, and help people and cases and discover the unknown, even creatures, vampires. It's incredible to me, and I will never care what anyone thinks.
And if any of you motherfuckers get in my way, you will surely live to regret it!
read you a chapter from 2 of my books. It's actually in 2 of my books, but a little bit different. It's called Seductive Vampirism. If you're looking for any of my books, they are on my website, paranormalprofessional.com. Here we go. The gothic horror of vampires and the dossier of their existence is present in every culture. These creatures predate the Bible. These creatures feed on the living to prevent their own decay. Blood is very serious when it comes to rituals around the world and all through the ages. I wrote about this in my paranormal investigating book as well, the blood, the importance of blood. I grew up researching vampires and absolutely loved them in every book, movie, or show that I found. During the time of the 19th century, the vampire myth started feeding into the Gothic literature, which led to Bram Stoker's writings. There are literally hundreds of different vampire creatures throughout the world, and the creatures go back in time further than the Bible itself. And vampire tales stretch back to France in the illustrious 1700s. But there's a lot of stuff in New England, too. I'll share that later. I have met more locals throughout my lifetime than I could ever recollect within the Crescent City, and their ghostly and vampiric stories are just intoxicating. There is one story that stands out from the rest of the unusual and strange vampire stories I have heard over the decades. One evening during my usual walk through the French Quarter, during the dusk hours, I met a sweet elderly man. We had a bourbon and a cigar while sharing haunted stories. I shared my demonology excursions as he shared his lifetime of stories. At one point, the stories turned from haunting spooks and laughter and stemmed towards a strange encounter he had within the French Quarter as a young boy regarding a possible vampiric encounter. That I hear strange and unusual stories from folks all over the world, and I know how it can sound when it's regurgitated. He told me that he was playing cards while his father would practice his jazz music in the streets of the French Quarter for the locals to make some extra coins. He told me that him and his father were in the French Quarter later than usual one night when the encounter took place. The young boy and his father had a hat placed down by their feet for coins, and someone dropped a bundle of cash into the hat as his father played his jazzy rhythm. The elderly man described a pale man with piercing black eyes, with a menacing and grinning smile. He said that the man looked like he had fangs. As he grinned with one half of his mouth. He was dressed in ravishing attire and had long shoulder-length hair. The man had a red silk vest underneath the black Victorian-style trench coat and very shiny shoes. On his Victorian trench coat was a brooch of a bat. This sounds pretty cliche, right? I had a difficult time believing this old man, but I amused his senses anyways and enjoyed the story as it proceeded. The elderly man told me that when this very well-groomed man walked away towards Charter Street, that he leaped up 3 or 4 stories and climbed onto a roof. He tried to tell his father, but no one believed him, and he never forgot what the man looked like. Or should I say the vampire? For some people and cultures around the world, vampires are terrifying reality. There are many testimonies of the creatures of legends. Farmers have said they would use their pitchforks to rip out the heart of a vampire that attacked them, and women have foretold a man entering into their room late in the dusk hours, and the man-creature biting her neck and drinking her blood. What is interesting are the archaeologists. assorted scientists and forensic specialists who discovered a possible vampire on Vampire Island. The discovery that shook the very foundations of archaeologists. Proof that vampires may not just exist in legend but in history itself. A tomb was discovered with a skeleton that had 3 20-centimeter stakes hammered into its throat, pelvis, and ankles. Strange, right? Within New Orleans, there are quite a few infamous vampires indeed. One vampire is Saint Germain in New Orleans. This alleged vampire was first encountered on Mount Shasta in Northern California. Occultist and author Guy Warren Ballard spoke of encounters with Saint Germain. Guy Ballard identified himself as an ascended master during this time. During a seance session long ago, I asked about ascended masters. They told me they were forbidden to tell me. I do talk about my seance sessions, by the way, quite often throughout my books. Again, this has been my whole life. Why would I not share? Saint Germain was a master of the piano and violin. He is described as an extraordinary and enigmatical character. He was said to be charming and gracefully engaging with many dukes and kings. He could converse in 6 different languages and was spoken highly of regarding his skills and intelligence as a conversationalist. He was very wealthy beyond comprehension as well. He was also known to carry gems with him. There were many who questioned where his wealth came from, but no one ever discovered the truth behind it. His blood relatives were unknown and the origins of his timeline were uncertain. He was a deeply involved alchemist during his time and would speak of history and chemistry in his social life rants. People began to notice that Saint Germain did not age. Speculators assumed it was his vast knowledge of herbs that kept him from aging, but the truth was never discovered. He was known as the man who knew everything and the man who could not die. Even though Saint Germain looked around 40 years of age, in his portraits, no one ever knew his true age. This gets even stranger though. For over half a century he continued to look completely unaged. No one ever saw him eat food during any feast or gathering, but he would exquisitely drink wine. He would throw lavish parties and invite the elite. He was known for large money bags, being very mysterious, and would never eat a morsel but would sip his wine. During his time in New Orleans, many blood-curdling vampiric incidents took place around this supposed vampire. One night, he was sitting on the balcony with a young woman, and he attempted to bite her neck. This took place on the corner of Ursulines Avenue and Royal Street within the French Quarter of New Orleans. The woman fell through the balcony during the struggle and ran to the police to report the incident. After this happened, the police went to Saint Germain's home and found tablecloths with blood all over them, but Saint Germain was nowhere to be found. During the investigation, the police searched the kitchen and found no trace of food ever being there. There are just so many clues that led one to believe the vampiric nature of the events. The police found a plethora of bottled wine and poured themselves a glass and discovered that the bottles were a mixture of blood and wine. If they had never poured a glass of wine, they would have never discovered this very important clue. He was reported to die in the year 1784, but many people reported seeing him many years after. New Orleans has always had one of the highest murder rates and is notorious for missing persons. For one to suspect a vampiric order within the Crescent City doesn't seem too far-fetched at this point. In 1932, brothers John and Wayne Carter emerged within the vampire foundations of the Crescent City. They were thought to be vampires due to the following events. The gruesome story of the brothers is quite interesting. These brothers abducted several individuals and tied them up in their apartment to slowly drain them of blood and drink it at the end of each day. That might be blood in there. Just kidding. One young woman escaped from the bondage and ran to the policemen. She led the police back to the apartment on Royal Street, and the police discovered 4 other people with their wrists slightly cut with blood draining from them. They were all tied to chairs, and some were there longer than others. It doesn't stop there, though. The police also found 14 corpses on the grounds that were drained of blood. After witnessing this seemingly sinister event, the officers waited for the 2 men to return home. It took over half a dozen men to hold down these average-sized men. Or should I say vampires? There are whispers that when the vampire drinks from a living human vessel for 7 days straight, that the vessel will become a vampire. One of the victims that survived was feasted on for over 7 days, and he became a serial killer. His name was Philippe. He killed 32 people and drank all 32 of the victims' blood. It's interesting, right?
But she did experience some issues for about 2 weeks. She couldn't stand light. She slept all day. She had all the symptoms of typical vampire ways.
A few years later, when the Carter brothers were executed, their bodies were placed inside of a New Orleans vault. Many years later, after the Carter brothers' execution, the vault empty. This is thought-provoking. Did someone rob the crypt of their bones for ritualistic purposes? My books always make you think. Were they truly vampires that resurrected from the grave? What happens next might unfold the truth. To this day, many reports of locals within the French Quarter report seeing 2 brothers that are identical to the Carter brothers. Years passed, and the new owner of their apartment reported 2 figures standing on the balcony of the apartment, matching the exact same description of the Carter brothers. The 2 men were witnessed whispering to each other, and then were witnessed jumping off of the 3rd-story balcony and proceeding to run away from the property. This is strange because of the encounter that the old man spoke of to me. He witnessed the strange vampiric man levitate and jump up 3 stories. What if what he saw as a little boy was indeed true? So the story becomes even more shocking at this point. France began sending women over to New Orleans. Some say they were nuns and others say they were harlots. The women were said to be carrying luggage in the shape of small coffins. There were around 300 coffin-like suitcases. Some stories say the coffins were empty, while others say the coffins were of the undead. Everyone kind of, New Orleanians and my aunties who are New Orleanians, they have the most interesting philosophy on this, I would say, because, they grow up around all of this as well. And there was always differing opinions on what was in those coffins, if anything at all. Later stories foretell that the coffin cases were stored in the attic of a convent within the French Quarter. The windows of the attic are nailed shut due to opening consistently without any explanation as to why. Haunted or just a cover to a new birthing legend? What do you think? I told you my book will make you think. Years later, reporters forced their way into the attic to see the coffins. The priest of the convent had declined the 2 reporters' request to enter the attic, which led to the 2 men trespassing. Don't trespass, folks. They wound up climbing over a wall with their filming equipment and spent the night within the attic. The next morning, the priest found the 2 men partially decapitated on the front porch of the convent, and their equipment scattered all over the street. Almost all of their blood was drained from their vessels. To this day, no one knows what happened. There are vampire parlors throughout the Crescent City, and a community of modern world vampires that coexist with the mundane and conjures to this day. If you are ever seeking a vampire or legends of the vampires, New Orleans is the place where you are most likely to find such a creature or the human-vampire hybrids within society today. But I may have to add that they're in Salem now, apparently, because I've never gotten an EVP during any of my seance sessions in New Orleans over many years about a vampire, and it's interesting, but I do in Salem, Massachusetts. Happy spooky season.
Dracula.
Angels, Protector, and the Eight. What can you tell me about vampires? A long time ago, I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula? Okay, hold on, my cat is doing something. Hold on a second. Just here, I'm gonna close this door. All right. I need my cats to be quiet. Here, turn this up.
What can you tell me about vampires? A long time ago, I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula? What can you tell me about vampires? A little while ago, I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula? What can you tell me about vampires? A long time ago, I asked you about Dracula and his tomb. What can you tell me about Dracula?
Okay, I'm going to ask one more time. I hear you saying something. Does or do vampires that drink human blood exist? Thank you very much.
Does or do vampires that drink human blood exist? Does or do vampires that drink human blood exist? Does or do vampires that drink human blood exist?
Okay. Thank you. Blessed be.